Morning sunlight slanted through the misted glass windows of the Haven Rescue Center, leaving soft streaks of light on the cold tile floor. The fresh air of early day hadn't yet swept away the chill of the night before. But for Ellie Collins, that was nothing compared to what waited behind the steel door at the end of the hallway. She was used to the sounds here: barking dogs, hurried footsteps, the clinking of metal, and even those faint whimpers only the truly attentive could hear. But this morning, as she stepped into the final row of kennels, the section reserved for the special cases, there was no sound at all. A suffocating silence filled the space. That's when Michael Turner, the center's director, pointed toward a lone kennel at the end of the hall and spoke softly, barely above a whisper. "We call him Duke." Ellie walked closer. The kennel door was made of thick wire mesh, and behind it was a creature melting into the shadows. Duke, a large German shepherd, looked nothing like the strong, loyal, courageous breed she knew. He was curled up in the farthest corner, his back pressed tightly to the wall, as if trying to fuse into the cold bricks. His once thick coat was now patchy, matted in places, as if eroded by time and fear. Protruding ribs jutted under dry, rough skin, outlining the form of a being who had long forgotten what it felt like to be full or safe. The breed's signature upright ears were now flattened hard against his skull, so tightly that it seemed every muscle in Duke's body was straining to make him invisible. A ghost, untouched, unnoticed. His eyes were shut, not in sleep, but in refusal. Refusal to see, refusal of the world, refusal of everything around him. Ellie felt her heart clench. Michael stood beside her and sighed. "He doesn't eat, doesn't drink, won't let anyone near him. We've tried. Every time we approach, he trembles like he's being tortured. Sometimes he growls, low and hoarse, not in threat, but as if begging us not to come closer." Ellie didn't respond. She just stood there, fingers gripping the wire mesh, eyes following the faint rise and fall of Duke's chest. With each small sound, a footstep, a door latch clinking in the distance, his body flinched slightly, as if every movement around him was a harbinger of pain. "His history is unclear," Michael continued, "but according to the rescue report, Duke was kept in a breeding facility for years. A filthy cage, no light, no touch except violence, no outdoors, no name, just a living body for reproduction." To Ellie, his words sounded like an indictment. She asked no more. Instead, she bowed her head slightly, then slowly knelt on the cold tile floor in front of Duke's kennel, keeping a safe distance. Not for her sake, but for his. Her hands rested gently on her knees, every movement slow and calm, like a gentle breath reaching out to the creature hiding in the shadows. No words, no coaxing. She simply sat there, letting Duke know someone was there, but would not hurt him. A soft breeze drifted through the gap beneath the hallway's back door, carrying the scent of morning. Leaves, earth, dew. But in that silent space, Ellie could smell only one thing clearly: the scent of fear. It had no shape, but it clung to every strand of fur, every tremble, every cautious movement like a child jolted from a long nightmare. And Duke, at that moment, was the embodiment of every silent wound, every soul forgotten in the dark. Ellie didn't know how long she would have to sit there. She didn't yet know how to pull Duke from the prison of fear he lived in. But she knew one thing: she wasn't going to leave. Duke's story wouldn't be rewritten in a morning, but Ellie believed this: if someone had enough patience to listen to the voices without sound, then even a dog who had lost all trust could learn to believe again. And she would start today, with eyes that refused to see, with a body that trembled, with a soul that had forgotten what it felt like to be touched by a gentle hand. Ellie tugged lightly at the hem of her coat and settled herself fully onto the cold tile floor in front of the kennel, legs crossed, back straight but relaxed, hands resting loosely on her knees. She knew any sudden move or direct gaze could make Duke recoil, and if the slightest ember of trust had a chance to spark, it would be snuffed out before it even formed. Michael still stood behind her, arms crossed, silent for a long while before finally speaking, his voice a mix of skepticism and concern. "How long do you plan to sit there, Ellie?" She didn't turn around. Her eyes remained on the dog in the corner, where Duke's shadow pressed like a dry leaf trying to survive winter. "As long as he's still there. That long. I'll sit." Michael sighed, his eyes carrying the weary look of someone who had seen this play out too many times before. "I've seen a lot of cases like this. Trust me, some dogs never come back. Not because they don't want to, but because the world's been too cruel to them for too long." Still, Ellie didn't move. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Then I'll be the first one who's not cruel to him." At this moment, Duke showed no reaction. He didn't open his eyes, didn't shift his body, didn't sniff the air like dogs normally do when someone new comes near. But his stillness made the silence even heavier, like a voiceless plea. "Please don't touch me again." And Ellie understood that. With all the respect for a pain she had never personally known, she chose stillness. Not to intrude, not to probe. She hadn't come to train or to tame. She came to wait. Not for a response, but for the most fragile of moments, when fear retreats just long enough for curiosity to peek out. Duke's eyes remained shut. But Ellie knew this wasn't sleep. It was a defense mechanism, closing off all senses to pretend the world no longer existed. The calluses on his elbows proved he had lain like that for years, his stomach drawn in, breathing fast but silent, and at times his whole body twitching with faint, involuntary jolts. A volunteer passed down the hallway, their footsteps accidentally clinking a chain at the next kennel. In a moment so quick it could barely be seen, Duke recoiled further into the wall, curling tighter, claws scraping faintly at the tile as if trying to dig deeper into the cold floor. He trusted no sound, because, in his memory, sound only meant pain. Ellie quietly took it all in. Her eyes stayed on Duke, but not as a watcher, but rather as someone waiting for a weary soul to find a place to rest. 1 minute, then 10, then 30 passed. He didn't move. Michael came back to check, saw Ellie still sitting there, shook his head, and walked away with another sigh. But Ellie didn't waver. To her, time was no longer measured in minutes or hours, but in steady breaths, in heartbeats of a wounded being learning how to exist beside a human again. She knew she couldn't touch Duke, couldn't feed him, couldn't whisper soothing words or offer gentle strokes, but there was one thing she could do, and she believed it was the foundation of everything else: to be present long enough for him to realize someone won't disappear after a single sound. Noon approached. The sunlight shifted across the floor, casting a thin beam across Ellie's body. Duke remained still, but his breathing seemed just a little slower, still trembling, but no longer flinching at every noise like before. Maybe, just maybe, somewhere inside, he had begun to sense that this silence held no threat, and Ellie, in the heart of that stillness, continued to sit, like a small landmark in Duke's chaotic world, a quiet reminder that today no one would hit, no one would pull, no one would tie a leash around his neck. Just a woman, patiently waiting, and a fragile hope beginning to take shape. As the quiet rhythm of noon carried on, the space around Duke's kennel remained nearly motionless, and in that silence, an image suddenly flickered across his mind, hazy, tangled, and reeking of metal. The present, though cold and unfamiliar, was still gentler than the memory now erupting within him, a memory that clung to his skin like a burn that never healed. And every time it returned, all he could do was curl deeper into the corner, hoping that what had happened was only a terrible dream. The old cage where Duke once lived had no light. The rusted iron bars wove tightly together, searing to the touch, yet they were the only thing he had ever known. No grass, no earth, just a cold, filthy concrete floor, stained with layers of feces and urine. Every morning the sound of chains clinking rang out, not to take anyone for a walk, but to drag someone away. And they never came back. Duke once had a friend, a smaller dog, floppy-eared, who used to press close against his back when the cold nights came. They had no names, but each breath, each faint whimper, was a quiet signal that at least they weren't alone. Then one day the kennel door creaked open. A hand grabbed the small dog, not gently, not slowly, but like snatching up an object without feeling. The little dog struggled, let out a sharp bark, then disappeared beyond the heavy steel door. Duke never saw him again. From that day on, Duke never barked. He made no sound, and he never touched another. Inside him, if trust had ever existed, it quietly vanished like a wisp of smoke. The humans who passed by, heavy boots, rough hands, ice-cold fingers, were nothing like Ellie, now sitting silently outside his kennel. Those hands didn't bring food. They didn't pet. They only grabbed, yanked, hit, or shoved pills down his throat. Sometimes Duke heard screaming. He didn't know from which dog, from which cage, but it always carried the same tone. Pain, despair, and unanswered cries. There was a time when Duke had a fever. He shivered from the cold and collapsed on the cage floor, unable to move. A man came, grabbed him by the scruff, dragged him out, and poured a bucket of cold water over his head. The smell of blood filled his nose. He didn't know if it was his or someone else's, but from that day Duke learned this. The weaker you are, the more punishment you receive. His world began to shrink. No more images, no more sounds, only instinct. Every hand could hurt. Every noise signaled danger. Every approach carried the scent of threat. Then one day, there was the sound of a truck. Barking. Frantic, scattered. Light flooded into the cage. Another hand, still cold, but instead of grabbing his neck, it lifted him wrapped in a blanket. Duke didn't resist. He was too weak to fight. But he didn't hope either. In the world, he knew, every place was just another cage. He was moved to Haven Rescue Center. And then, into this kennel. The light now still overwhelmed him. The human breath still made him flinch. Footsteps made his ears twitch by reflex. Not to listen, but to prepare. He didn't know if this world was any better. All he knew was that the fear hadn't left. In the corner of the kennel, Duke's eyes remained tightly shut. But beneath his heavy lids, his mind repeated every memory. The clang of steel, the piercing whimpers, the desperate howls from the years he spent in confinement. And that's why, when a woman sat silently outside his kennel all morning, Duke couldn't comprehend it. He couldn't believe it. He couldn't imagine someone being present without taking something. He didn't know if that hand was any different from the others, but he sensed one thing. This person made no threatening sound. Didn't bang the cage, didn't call out, didn't come closer, and most importantly, didn't leave. In Duke's fractured mind, that wasn't a signal of safety, but it was something else. He didn't know what to call it, didn't dare to trust, but it felt like a sliver of light slipping through the tangled bars of his past. And that, small as it was enough to make him pause, just for a beat, as he trembled in his familiar darkness. He might not understand the presence, might not dare name it, but somewhere in that dense, distorted archive of human memory, a faint thread was beginning to stir, slowly but steadily. The afternoon sun touched the roof of the rescue center with soft, slanted rays. The early morning chill had eased, but the tile beneath Ellie's feet still held the damp coldness of the concrete walls surrounding the kennels. She remained still, unchanged in posture, unbothered by the hours. She knew she wasn't here to train or improve behavior. She was here to be the one thing Duke had never known, a presence that didn't carry harm. Time stretched endlessly. Volunteers passed by, some pausing briefly, then returning to their duties. They were all used to difficult cases. Biting dogs, withdrawn dogs, dogs that refused contact. But what set Duke apart wasn't his behavior, but his state of being. He didn't resist, didn't bark, didn't look, didn't react. He existed as if entirely disconnected from the living world around him, his detachment so absolute it felt like facing a wall, smooth, blank, without a door. Then, in a moment no one else noticed, Ellie saw it. Duke's left ear twitched. Just the faintest movement, like a reflex to a passing sound, like a leaf stirring in the wind before it knows why. But for a creature who had shut down all senses, it was the first sign of awareness. Ellie didn't move. She held her breath. Her eyes remained angled toward the kennel, soft and unpiercing. She knew even a gaze with too much weight could make Duke shrink back instantly. She didn't want him to feel watched, monitored, or tested. She only wanted him to know she was there, with no intention to harm. A few minutes later, his right ear did the same, twitching slightly, then relaxing. German shepherds usually hold their ears high, alert to sound. But Duke wasn't upright. He didn't yet trust the outside world, nor were they pinned flat in terror like that morning. Now, they were in between, suspended between fear and perception, a place of fragility, yet life. His breathing, something Ellie had tracked closely, also shifted. From rapid, laborious gasps for survival, his inhales lengthened and slowed. He still lay motionless, eyes closed, body, but he no longer flinched with every passing sound. In the golden light pouring through the metal bars, his thin frame seemed to release a fraction of the invisible tension that had gripped every fiber of him. And Ellie, the one woman who still sat unmoved amid the world spinning around her, knew something had changed. Not dramatically, not clearly, but enough to make her heart ache with hope. In a world built on silent wounds, the smallest movement could be a monumental step. She didn't speak, didn't praise, didn't sigh in relief. She knew that any celebration too soon might send Duke retreating again. She simply tilted her head slightly and closed her eyes for a few seconds, as if to engrave this moment in her memory, so that in harder days ahead she could remind herself. Duke moved. He listened. In the corner of the kennel, Duke didn't know the weight of what he'd done. To him, it was just a vague reaction. But to Ellie, it was the first silent hello. A kind of whisper without words, yet full of meaning. I know you're there. I'm not sure I can trust you, but I've noticed you. And on a day like any other, among hundreds just like it, for a dog who had been broken to his core, the simple fact that his ears were no longer pressed flat against his skull marked the first time Duke had turned, not with his eyes but with his soul, to listen to a human being. Ellie didn't rush. She knew that with souls drained to the bone, every connection had to be rewoven strand by strand, with patience, with presence, with a heart that demanded nothing in return. And today, though there was no bark, no returning gaze, no tail wagging with joy, there was an ear, slightly moved in silence. And so the quiet but miraculous healing story had truly begun. He had begun his journey back into the light, not with a dash or a wagging tail, but through the faintest twitch of an ear, a slight change in breath. But to Ellie, every one of those fragments mattered. Every tiny shift was worth remembering, because she understood. In the world of creatures who've survived the razor edge of pain, every beginning must rise from trust reborn through silent presence. The afternoon had dipped low, and sunlight stretched long and pale across the worn tile floor. The rescue center had quieted. Many volunteers had gone home, and the barking had faded to scattered, tired notes, like the last exhales of the day. Ellie was still there, unmoving, unhurried, doing nothing but being. And that, as simple as it seemed, was the only way to step into Duke's sealed world. After a long while, she slowly leaned forward, so slowly that even the breeze might have shattered the moment, and slipped her hand into her coat pocket. Inside was something small, brought from home that morning. A piece of cooked chicken, steamed until soft and lightly brushed with olive oil. Not just fragrant, but with a clean sweetness preserved in each tender fiber. She had wrapped it in a clean napkin as carefully as if preparing a meal for a fragile child. Ellie gently unfolded the napkin, then placed the piece of chicken on the tile just outside the kennel. Not so close it would feel like pressure, but not so far that Duke would have to cross his limits to reach it, just close enough for the choice to be truly his. She didn't call him, didn't coax, didn't meet his eyes. She simply returned to her sitting position, hands relaxed on her lap, shoulders soft, head slightly inclined toward the kennel. Ready, but not waiting. Duke still lay motionless, like a block of stone. But anyone observant would notice his body was no longer drawn as tight as a wire. His ears weren't alert, but they weren't pinned either. His head stayed low, but there was something, some small shift along his back, a subtle vibration between two extremes, to retreat or to try. A breeze drifted down the hallway, carrying the scent of fresh-cooked meat through the air. Ellie saw Duke's nostrils twitch. For the first time since they met, he smelled something that didn't signal danger, but awakened a distant memory. Something warm, full, evoking survival and nourishment. Maybe it was the first time he recalled the scent of food not thrown at him with shouts. Time seemed to halt. A movement, so small. One of Duke's front paws slid forward, not more than a hand's length, but enough to make Ellie's heart seize in her chest. No one had commanded him. No one had tugged a leash or shouted orders. Duke was deciding. His nose stretched forward, sniffing, slow and broken, like a wanderer daring to approach a campfire for the first time. His eyes stayed shut, but his breaths came faster, his chest rising and falling as if his own heart opposed his action. Ellie saw the internal struggle, between survival instinct and memories of betrayal. And then, after one deep, trembling inhale, Duke suddenly sprang forward, not in aggression, but in a reflexive jolt, as if his body had moved beyond his control. He lunged, snatched the chicken in his mouth, and immediately retreated, curling back into the corner of the kennel, pressed hard against the wall, breathing rapidly as he'd just escaped a trap. The chicken was gone. He had vanished back into the shadows. But one thing couldn't be taken back. Duke had stepped out by choice. Ellie remained still. She didn't smile, didn't praise, but her hands tightened briefly on her lap, then released. A quiet exhale of tension built up all day. What she felt wasn't simple happiness, but something deeper, quieter, a reverent awe, as if she had just witnessed something sacred. Rebirth. Because the truth is, in any journey of healing there are no small steps. For Duke, that first movement wasn't just biological, it was a decision. He had chosen, for a fleeting moment, to set aside fear, to step into memory, and to reach toward something beyond pain. He still hadn't looked at Ellie. Still couldn't. But he had sensed she didn't rush toward him, didn't claim anything, didn't overreact. And somewhere deep in that fragmented mind, a realization was taking shape. Maybe this human was different. Maybe not all of them would hurt him. In the last twilight light falling across the floor, Ellie whispered, not aloud, but in her heart. You stepped out, you were brave, and you won't have to return to the dark alone ever again. She knew tomorrow could bring setbacks, but today she had witnessed a real step forward, fragile as it was, and that was why she would return, tomorrow morning and every day after, not just to bring another piece of chicken, but to bring the belief that even legs once chained can learn to walk toward kindness. But the next morning didn't begin with hope. It began with a soft voice calling her from the hallway, just as she entered the center. Michael Turner was waiting at the far end of the corridor, his face heavier than usual. He avoided her eyes, and his hand kept rubbing the back of his neck, a long-standing habit whenever he faced a decision he didn't truly believe in. Ellie, he said, his voice low, there's something you need to know. She froze, her brows narrowed, unease rising. What is it? Michael motioned for her to follow. They walked past the intake area and turned into a small back office behind the kennel block. Inside, a single desk, a lamp, and a folder sat in the center like a weight pulling down the air. He opened the file, flipped through a few pages, and pointed to a red printed line. Status: unapproachable. Recommend humane euthanasia. Ellie felt the air rush out of her lungs. "What is this?" she asked, her voice low and tight. Michael exhaled, resting a hand on the folder. "It's the list of animals recommended for humane release. We're overwhelmed, Ellie. Dozens of dogs arrive each week. Many need urgent care, but many still have good adoption chances. But Duke, he's not eating, won't allow contact, won't let the vet examine him. The medical reports note no meaningful progress in over a week. With limited resources, the board has to choose." The last sentence hit Ellie like a dull knife through the chest. She didn't respond right away. Her eyes slowly lifted from the folder to Michael's face, holding back the storm swirling within. "You're saying they want to put him down?" Her voice wasn't angry, just shocked and quietly devastated. Michael gave a slight nod, still avoiding her gaze. Ellie stepped back. She had to grip the chair behind her to stay upright. Her mind flooded with yesterday's image of Duke. The small paw stretch, the trembling inhale, the moment of decision as he reached for the chicken. That wasn't an illusion. She had seen a living being fighting to survive, trying to find a path back to life. "No," she whispered, then straightened, her voice beginning to shake. "He's making progress. Not much, but real. I've seen it. You weren't there all day. You didn't see how he moved, how his ears twitched, how he followed the smell of food with every ounce of courage a broken soul can muster." Michael stayed silent. He didn't argue, but sometimes silence is crueler than refusal. Ellie drew a deep breath. She stepped to the desk, pushed the folder gently aside, and placed both hands flat on the wood. Her voice was steady, but every word was pulled from her heart. "Give me 1 week. Just one. I'll do anything. Overnight shifts, cleaning, inventory, training, medical assistance. Anything. But please don't take away his last chance. I believe, with enough time, Duke will step out of that corner. I've seen the light in him. He doesn't want to die, Michael. He just doesn't know how to live again yet." The silence stretched. The wall clock ticked like a metronome, counting down the tense beats inside the tiny room. Finally, Michael sighed, rubbing his forehead. "All right," he said, voice heavy, like a key falling onto the tile. 1 week. But if there's no clear change in behavior or health, I can't keep that file off the list any longer." Ellie nodded. No argument. To her, 1 week was everything. She turned and walked out quickly, as if pausing might let the pain in her chest break her completely. At the end of the hallway, where Duke's kennel still stood, she stopped, took a deep breath, and then knelt. Duke was still in the corner, eyes slightly open. He looked at her, for the first time. The gaze was blurry and uncertain, but it was a reaction. Ellie smiled, though her eyes brimmed with tears. She spoke softly, not loud enough to startle, but clear enough for a damaged soul to hear. "We've got 7 days, Duke, and I'll be here for every one of them." And she knew that miracles always begin with the smallest things: a glance, a breath, a quiet belief that someone has seen you and chooses not to walk away. The next morning, Ellie arrived at the center earlier than usual. The sky was still dim, casting a faint light just bright enough to reveal a film of dew on the glass panes. In her hand, as always, was a small plastic container wrapped in cloth. Inside it, a portion of steamed chicken she had prepared the night before. No strong seasoning, just gently cooked, soft enough for the stomach of a dog who hadn't eaten properly in days. To others, it was just meat. But to Ellie, it was a message, a wordless invitation, a thread of connection made from feeling, not speech. She walked through the familiar corridor, past kennels where a few dogs had already awakened and wagged their tails in greeting. But she didn't stop. Her path had always led to one place only: the last kennel at the end of the hall, where Duke lay. But before reaching it, she turned into the office to retrieve the monitoring sheet. That's where she saw Clara. Clara stood beside the medicine cabinet, eyes scanning through a report, though her lips held a soft smile upon seeing Ellie. Her silver hair was neatly tied back, her white coat slightly wrinkled but always clean, and her hands, those hands that had treated hundreds of wounds, still held the gentleness of someone touching a fragile life for the very first time. "You still come in every day?" Her voice was warm and low, tempered by years of calm resilience. Ellie nodded, a little hesitant. She didn't know how much Clara knew. Word about Duke might have spread, and she feared someone might try to stop her. But then Clara stepped forward, with no judgment in her eyes, only a depth of understanding that made Ellie's throat suddenly tighten. "I heard about Duke, about that list." Clara didn't need to say more. Ellie knew she meant that list, the harsh one, where dogs deemed beyond saving were marked for humane release because the center couldn't afford to keep them all indefinitely. Ellie lowered her head. For a brief moment, her heart felt as cold as the early morning air. But before she could speak in Duke's defense, Clara stepped closer and laid a hand gently on her arm, with a tenderness that needed no words. "You don't need to prove anything. I've already seen it." Ellie looked up. Clara's eyes held no pity, only a quiet certainty, one forged through experience, compassion, and the healing of wounds over time. "There are things that don't show up in behavior reports. They don't get recorded in medical charts. But I've seen them. The way Duke sniffs the air when you come near. The way he startles less. The way his breathing softens when you sit outside his kennel. I've been here long enough to know. Those little things are the beginning of recovery." Then Clara walked to the file cabinet, pulled out a form, and began filling it out. "Psychological progress observed. Responsive to food scent. Shows capacity to establish non-invasive contact with humans. Recommend continued monitoring and extended observation period, 7 days. Ellie stood in stunned silence as the words appeared, line by line, in Clara's careful handwriting. Before she could even whisper thank you, Clara looked up and smiled gently. "Did you know?" Clara said, her voice lowering, becoming more intimate. "Years ago I watched a dog exactly like Duke. Abandoned in a warehouse, beaten, wouldn't let anyone near. We were about to put him down, until a 10-year-old boy started coming every day. He'd sit by the kennel, read stories, and hum little songs. No touching, no pressure, just presence. After 3 weeks, that dog stepped out and laid his head in the boy's lap. And from that day on, he never turned away from humans again." She put her pen down, her voice now deeper, truer. "Duke doesn't yet know he's being given a chance, but you are making him feel it, even in silence. And I believe, just like that other dog, he will step out, not for food, not for command, but because his heart will slowly recognize that this time, someone's here not to hurt him." The report was signed and clipped into the file. Clara promised to submit it directly to the board, ensuring it wouldn't disappear among cold, impersonal assessments. Before leaving the office, Ellie paused at the door. She turned back, her voice low and sincere. "Thank you. Not just for the report, but for believing." Clara replied with a steady gaze. "Keep going. I'll be here if you need me, and I'll always stand with the souls others gave up on." As Ellie stepped back into the corridor toward Duke's kennel, her grip on the small food container tightened. But more than that, she carried something new now. She was no longer alone. Amid doubtful looks, rigid behavior scores, and the chill of formal judgments, there were still people who chose to believe in a small shiver, a faint paw movement, a barely formed glance. And in Duke's world, which once seemed completely closed, a new door had begun to open. A door toward the light, unlocked by the hearts of those who never stopped listening. When Ellie returned to the familiar kennel corridor, morning sunlight had begun to spill in. The first rays pierced the glass, casting warm golden patches across the cold tile floor. The air was fresh, but what was spreading in Ellie's chest wasn't just hope. It was something delicate, profound, as if she were about to touch something rare and deeply sacred. She knelt beside Duke's kennel, same spot, same posture, legs folded, hands resting gently on her thighs, her presence calm, as if she'd never left. Before her, a small piece of chicken lay neatly on the floor, offered without urgency, without allure. Just a quiet offering between two beings who had grown up in separate worlds. Duke was still curled in the corner, but something had changed. His breathing was steadier. His ears, no longer pressed flat, now tilted forward, not high with alertness, but not avoiding either. His thin chest rose and fell slowly. And then, after a long, suspended silence, as if everything was waiting for a moment that couldn't yet be named, he lifted his head. For the first time since arriving at the center, Duke looked directly into a human's eyes. There was no growl, no panic, no violent trembling like before. Just a gaze, barely 3 seconds long, but as weighty as a breath drawn after surfacing from deep water. Ellie held her breath. Her eyes didn't dart, didn't press, just received the look, gently, like welcoming a soul that had just found its sliver of light. Duke's eyes didn't shine with trust yet. There was hesitation, a flicker of doubt, a fine mist of fear that hadn't yet lifted, but they were no longer empty. In that glance, Ellie saw a question, silent and raw, but it reached her to the core. Can I trust? It wasn't the look of surrender, nor was it the vacant stare of the dog from before. It was the look of a soul trying to find its way back, lifting itself out of suspicion, daring to wonder, is this real? Will that hand stay gentle? Will this presence remain long enough for me to risk belief? And Ellie, saying nothing, simply nodded, perhaps to Duke, perhaps to herself, because she knew that when a dog once broken by humans still finds the courage to look into a human's eyes again, that is a miracle. No barking is needed. No approach is required. Just a look that no longer turns away. Duke kept watching her, and she sat still, no leaning forward, no hand reaching out. She knew everything was still fragile, like a tender sprout just breaking through frost. But that didn't make her afraid. It made her certain, because a gaze that could pierce through silence and memory meant that the next steps, however slow, would come. As the sunlight stretched longer across the floor, Duke blinked once, then gently lowered his head back to the ground. Not further into the corner, not curled into himself, just a lowering of the head, after having faced the world he once feared. Ellie exhaled softly, afraid to break the moment. But inside her something bloomed. Not fleeting joy, but a root-deep hope. From now on she knew she was no longer sitting before a locked door, but before a pair of eyes that had opened, still cautious, still slow, but brave enough to ask if a new beginning might be possible. And Ellie would not leave, because she knew, sometimes a single look is enough to prove that a soul still wants to live. And Ellie understood that at that moment, Duke had taken control of his emotions, for the first time. No one pushed him. No one intervened. He had chosen to approach. And in doing so, he began to receive something he'd never once been given in all his life: tenderness. The next morning, as Ellie stepped into the corridor still veiled in mist, the center's main lights were not yet on. Only the faint daylight filtered through the high window panes, casting scattered patches of light across the cold tile floor. The air was uncannily quiet. No barking, no clinking bowls. Only the silence seemed to listen to her every step as she made her way toward the last kennel. She arrived earlier than usual. In her hand was the familiar chicken container she had prepared the night before. But today, she carried something else. Not hope anymore, but a quiet certainty. Something was taking shape. No longer a one-sided effort, but something growing, slowly, from both sides. Duke was lying down, as always. But what made Ellie stop in her tracks was his posture. He wasn't curled away in the corner as before. He wasn't hiding. He lay on his side, eyes half open, facing the hallway, as if expecting something familiar. And when his gaze caught her silhouette, there was no fear, no retreat, just a slow blink, like a silent acknowledgement. I see you. Ellie sat down, just as she always did. Same place, same posture. She opened the container, took out a small piece of chicken, placed it in her palm, and lowered her hand to the floor. Still open, not extended. It wasn't an offering of expectation, but of readiness. Duke didn't react immediately. He watched, he sniffed, his ears twitched with every distant sound, the creak of wheels, the breeze slipping through a door. But unlike the days before, those sounds didn't send him backward. They only made him pause, assess. And then, what Ellie had been waiting for began to happen. He stepped forward, slowly, cautiously, but unmistakably. Each paw landed like he was testing the ground. He didn't lunge like that first time, snatching food out of desperation. He was moving with something new, not just survival instincts, but agency. A choice. When he was no more than a stride away from her hand, Duke paused. His nose flared, pulling in a long breath, and then his whiskers brushed Ellie's fingers. It wasn't a clear touch, not a nuzzle or a press like dogs often do when they're comfortable. But to Ellie this meant more than any show of obedience. This was contact, not because he was forced, but because he chose to reach out to a human. Ellie didn't speak, didn't smile, didn't stroke his head. She simply remained still, letting the warmth of her skin carry a message that needed no voice. "You're safe. No one here will hurt you." Duke pulled back after that brief contact. He didn't take the chicken. He simply stepped back halfway and stopped, his eyes still on her hand. No trembling, no panic, just the watchfulness of a being testing the edge of trust. Ellie kept her posture. Her palm began to tingle from the blood pooling in her fingers, but she didn't move. She knew, in these moments, stillness was language. It told Duke that there was no rush, that everything would unfold at his rhythm, that her presence came with no pressure, no demands. Then he stepped forward again, just a little more. This time his nose fully touched her palm, gliding over the chicken but not taking it. His breath warmed her skin. Cautious, aware, his whiskers brushed her again, more firmly than before. And then again, he retreated, back to his spot. Lay down, facing her, as if he had just done something monumental and now needed time to process it. Ellie gently placed the piece of chicken in the food tray nearby, then stayed seated for a long time more, saying nothing, never breaking her gaze from the figure now resting calmly. Inside her rose a feeling too deep for simple joy. It was a sacred kind of awe, like she had just been let in on a secret Duke had kept hidden all his life. A faint touch, a glance, a breath on the skin, all tiny details. But in the world of a dog who had never known gentleness, they were nothing short of revolutionary. And Ellie knew Duke was opening a door long shut bit by bit, not rushed, but real. That evening, as Ellie left the center, the sunset stretched shadows across the road leading to the parking lot. She looked back at the building with a heart both heavy and light. In that small kennel at the end of the hall, a soul was learning how to live again. And today, for the first time in his life, he had reached out to a human, by choice, with courage. And she knew that was a gift no one could demand, only receive if they stayed long enough, patiently enough, to be worthy of it. The following days passed with a gentle rhythm. Each morning, Ellie arrived right on time. Each time she sat in the same spot, her palm open with a warm piece of chicken, just enough to draw Duke near, but never enough to overwhelm him. And gradually, the touches became less rare. Each time Duke's whiskers grazed her fingers, each breath he took close to her open hand, Ellie felt she was part of something sacred, a soul, once shattered, now giving humanity a second chance. Then, one afternoon, as sunlight tilted across the hallway's far wall, the silence Ellie had carefully cultivated shattered. A sudden, sharp crash rang out. Someone had dropped a large metal tray in the back room. The clatter echoed through concrete and steel, ricocheting down the kennel corridor and pierced straight into the space where Duke had only just begun to feel safe. In the span of a heartbeat, Duke was gone. Not physically, but emotionally. His gaze darted wildly, his body shot upright, and his breathing exploded like a balloon snapping inside his chest. He no longer looked at Ellie. He darted backward and slammed into the stone wall behind him, shaking violently as if every memory had been ripped back to the surface. His head dropped, ears flattened, tail tucked so tightly it disappeared. His body was no longer the form of a dog learning trust, but the terrified shell of a creature who knew only fear. Fear of noise, fear of space, fear of his hope that had dared to reach out too soon. Ellie said nothing. She didn't move closer. She knew, if she followed instinct, if she reached out, comforted, stroked, everything they'd built could collapse in an instant. In Duke's world, even affection could feel like an ambush. So instead, she stayed still, sat in the same posture, at the same distance, no change, no movement, no expectation. Her hands remained open on her lap. Her gaze stayed soft, not fixed on his frightened eyes. She breathed deeply, steadily, as if to send one message without words. "Things are not okay, but I'm still here. I won't leave." Time slowed. The hallway itself seemed to hold its breath with her. Duke didn't move. He remained curled, trembling, his body a taut wire. But minute by minute, the sound faded. No one approached. No one touched him. And most importantly, Ellie stayed. After 15 long minutes of stillness, punctuated only by the wind outside and Duke's ragged breaths, he began to settle. Still shaking, but less violently. He lifted his head ever so slightly, not to look directly, but to check. Was the world still dangerous? And what he saw first was Ellie. Still there, still sitting, still unshaken. Her presence was an anchor that kept him from slipping back into the void. In a blink, his eyes met hers. Just briefly, but in that gaze, Ellie saw something she had never seen in him before. Surprise. As if he were asking, "Why are you still here? Why didn't you disappear like the others? Why didn't you get angry or walk away?" No words were needed, no touch. Just her steady presence, calm, unwavering, unchanging, was enough for Duke to begin recognizing a simple but profound truth. Not every noise brings pain. Not every person will leave when he retreats. As dusk fell, Ellie still hadn't moved. She waited a little longer, then slowly stood. No sudden sounds, no backward glance. She knew that today, though there had been no touch, no progress forward, it had been the most important test of all for the trust they were building. And she also knew that no matter how far Duke stepped back, she would still be there, the one constant. Because sometimes, what heals a wound is not grand gestures, but the silent constancy that holds steady during the collapse. Ellie didn't leave, and for Duke, that may have been the first miracle he ever believed in. The next morning, Ellie returned to the center as usual. Inside the shelter, everything was still quiet. No one had turned on the lights yet. Only the fresh morning light slipped through the high windows, stretching across the gray tiles in gentle, mist-like beams. But in her heart, this day wasn't quite like the others. She knew that after Duke's panic the previous afternoon, what she was walking into wasn't just the continuation of their routine. It was a true test. Recovering from a collapse, especially for a soul that has lived in the dark, is always harder than starting from scratch. Because now, it wasn't just fear. They also had to contend with doubt about the brief moments of safety before. And Ellie understood. If Duke chose not to look at her today, if he returned to retreating into himself, she would still sit there. She would begin again, without a single complaint. When she turned into the hallway leading to the last kennel, her heartbeat slowed. She paused for a moment before stepping forward, drawing a deep breath as though entering sacred ground that demanded reverence. Then she moved ahead, gently kneeling in her usual place, hands on her lap, eyes toward the kennel, where Duke lay. And instantly, she met his gaze. Not startled, not turning away, not filled with the intense caution she had feared. Just a steady look, low but focused on her, as though he was weighing something. And in that moment, Ellie needed no other proof. Duke remembered. He hadn't forgotten she was the one who stayed. He didn't get up. He didn't come forward like he had in recent days. But his ears weren't pinned back. His chest didn't rise and fall in panicked bursts. His breathing was steady. And most of all, his eyes didn't leave hers. Ellie slowly slipped her hand into her coat pocket and pulled out a small piece of chicken. Steamed, soft, no strange smells. She opened her palm, lowered it just above the ground, and extended it forward a few inches. No words, no invitation, just a quiet offering. The choice was Duke's. He watched, his nose twitched, one front paw lifted slowly, then touched down. He inched forward. Not fast, not eager, but he did not step back. There was no internal tug-of-war, no muscle locked in fear. Something in him had changed. Not a forgetting of fear, but a way to step through it. Duke moved closer, step by step, until he stopped just a hand's length from Ellie. The scent of chicken lingered in his breath, trailing behind a newly forming memory of a hand that didn't hurt, a warmth that came without threat, a presence that made no demands. He lowered his head. He took the piece gently between his teeth, not with a lunge, not with a snap like before. Ellie didn't move, didn't even breathe too deeply. She felt his breath brush across her hand as he reached forward, and her heart tightened, not from worry, but from overwhelming tenderness. Because right now Duke was choosing to trust again, even after falling apart just yesterday. After swallowing the meat, he didn't back away immediately. He stood still for a few seconds. His eyes glanced down at her still open hand, then up, to her face. Just a flicker. But it was different now. Not evaluating, not guarded. It was a new kind of look. Silent, inquisitive, and most importantly, not asking, "Can I trust you?" But rather, "Will you stay?" Ellie tilted her head slightly. She said nothing, but her gaze softened as if to answer, "Yes, I'm still here. Today, tomorrow, and as long as you need." She wouldn't disappear after one setback. She wouldn't be upset if he fell behind. She wouldn't expect tail wags or affection just yet. And Duke, without saying a thing, without showing it overtly, responded in the only way she could have hoped for. He stayed. His breathing remained calm. He didn't run. He didn't hide. He stood there, in her presence, and that alone was a quiet declaration. "I remember. I haven't forgotten. I'm learning how to believe again." That morning brought no dramatic milestone, no head in her lap, no joyful tale. But in the world of the once abandoned, the decision not to retreat after fear was its kind of victory. A victory big enough for Ellie to sit still for a long while, her chest full. Not with worry, but with gratitude. Because this creature, once broken, was slowly piecing himself back together. And when she left the center that noon, her shadow trailing across the stone path, her heart was light, like someone who had passed through a storm and found the light still slipping through the window. The test had come, and Duke, in his quietest and bravest way, had passed. That morning passed in warm silence. There wasn't much movement, but Duke's presence, his steady gaze, his approach without fear, and his decision to eat from Ellie's hand, was undeniable proof that something within him was changing. Breathe by breath. Ellie knew this wasn't magic. It was built from countless moments that once seemed small and forgettable, accumulated through patience and presence, helping a closed-off soul learn to believe in a world that once terrified it. The next day, Ellie returned with a quiet gentleness she couldn't put into words. She passed through the still sleepy corridors, past the rows of kennels and curious glances, but she didn't look around. She knew exactly who she was there for, and why her presence mattered. Duke was sitting, not lying down like before. His posture had a hint of hesitance, but lacked the taut anxiety of the past. When he saw Ellie, his ears twitched slightly. He didn't jump or wag his tail like other dogs, but his eyes focused on her, and that alone made Ellie's steps feel lighter than air. She sat down slowly and gently, avoiding sudden movements. The space between them, like always, was a sanctuary of quiet, preserved like a promise. But today, something in Duke's eyes told Ellie she might be able to take a slightly bigger step. She didn't hold out food this time. Her hand was empty, resting on her knee, palm open and facing up. She didn't speak. She simply waited. Duke looked at her, then at her hand. A long breath passed between them. He leaned forward, not urgently, not fearfully, but like a being cautiously exploring something he'd never fully understood. Then, slowly, like a leaf drifting on air, he brought his nose to her open palm. For the first time, Duke initiated a touch. Ellie held her breath. She didn't smile, didn't speak. She kept her hand still, letting its warmth flow into the cool skin of his nose. For one long second, neither moved. Just two beings, listening to each other's hearts without the need for explanation. Then, ever so gently, Ellie lifted her fingertips and brushed the bridge of his nose. A touch soft as spring wind. It wasn't petting. It wasn't coaxing. It was a whispered message through the skin. "You're safe now?" Duke flinched, a reflex from years of being hurt. But the thing that nearly made Ellie cry was this. He didn't run. He didn't retreat. He didn't tuck into the corner. He simply paused half a second and remained where he was. And in that stillness, so much was happening inside him. Maybe confusion, maybe wonder at being touched without pain, maybe shock at realizing that not all hands hit, and maybe, just maybe, the beginning of understanding that what he had just felt was gentleness. Ellie didn't rush it. She slowly withdrew her hand back to her knee so he wouldn't feel pressured. She didn't need more. What mattered had already happened. Not in her actions, but in Duke's decision to let himself be touched. She looked at him, not with the eyes of a trainer expecting a response, but with the gaze of someone who had witnessed something rare, a soul opening. Duke glanced at her once more, then lay down, not curled up, not shielding himself, but resting his chin across his front paws as if settling in for peaceful rest. He faced her. His eyes were open. His breathing was calm, and the nose that had just felt her touch moved with a soft, steady rhythm. Ellie didn't need anything more. In that moment, she felt one truth. That true gentleness isn't loud or showy, but born from a creature who once lived in fear, choosing, finally, to lean into an open hand. And maybe, just maybe, in that quiet second, they were both relearning how to reach for the world, not to own it, but to understand that when emotion is offered the right way, at the right time, it always finds its way back to life. A few days after their first encounter, the atmosphere at the rescue center grew quieter, not silent, but more hushed. Amid the familiar sounds, the distant barking, the volunteers' footsteps, the soft clink of kennel locks, Ellie began to notice a new kind of movement. Small, almost imperceptible, but steady, like a second breath quietly threading its way through Duke's world. The boy appeared on a Wednesday morning, holding his mother's hand, quiet as a falling leaf. He was about 8 years old, slender, with chestnut hair falling over his forehead, and in his eyes, a strange gentleness not often seen in children his age. His mother, tired-eyed but kind, brought him to take part in an emotional therapy program for special children, a pilot initiative held at the center by psychologists working alongside veterinarians. His name was Elliot, and Elliot didn't speak. He hadn't spoken since he was 3, after an incident his mother never discussed with outsiders. But through his gaze, his careful steps, and the way he gently placed his hands on objects, people could sense a delicate, deep, and fragile world within him. While other children played and interacted with the more sociable dogs, Elliot always quietly walked the hallway. No noise, no laughter, but every time, without fail, when he passed by Duke's kennel, he stopped. At first, just for a few seconds, then half a minute, then longer. He stood still, arms hanging at his sides, eyes fixed through the wire mesh, watching Duke lying in his kennel, where the light slanted in through the window, sometimes catching the sadness in Duke's brown eyes, making them shimmer like something on the verge of breaking. Elliot didn't smile. He didn't blink repeatedly like curious kids do. He just looked, a gaze that wasn't invasive, didn't demand, didn't pressure. His eyes were like early morning light slipping through a crack in the door, simply there, asking nothing in return. And strangely, Duke didn't turn away. At first, he only glanced back, then looked away again. But soon, those glances became longer, deeper, no more tension, no more guarded stares, just a silent exchange between two beings who had never known words, but were somehow understanding each other through something vague and pure. Ellie began to notice their interaction. She didn't interfere. She stood at a distance and observed. Something real was happening between Duke and the boy. Something no adult could explain. Perhaps it was a natural empathy between wounded souls. Or maybe their silence itself had become a language connecting two worlds that had never been named. One afternoon, after the other children had gone, Elliot lingered in the hallway. His mother stood at the far end, chatting with Dr. Clara, and Elliot remained in front of Duke's kennel, hand resting lightly on the wire. Not too close, just enough for the warmth of his skin to reach through the cold metal. And Duke, after lying still for a long time, slowly lifted his head. No startle, no retreat, just a quiet look, like someone lost suddenly recognizing something familiar in a strange place. No words were spoken, but in that moment, Ellie knew. Something had just taken root, fragile but real. And maybe Elliot, with his quiet, sheltering presence, had brought something not even Ellie could reach. Absolute empathy. Not through language, not through action, but through the pure presence of a soul not yet further wounded by the world. And Duke, with all his caution and slowness, was beginning to realize that a child stood there every day, asking for nothing, only watching, being, just as Ellie had once sat for hours in silence. But this time, it came from a child, small, vulnerable, yet somehow capable of filling a void in Duke that even the gentlest hands couldn't reach. Elliot didn't speak, but his eyes seemed to whisper, "I'm like you. I know what it's like to be swallowed by silence. But if you're not afraid, I won't be either." And Duke, after all those days of learning to trust, might just begin to understand. Sometimes, a quiet gaze is all it takes to become a first home. In the mornings that followed, Elliot continued to come with his mother. He still walked slowly down the hallway, arms resting loosely by his sides, his eyes soft as a stream. No one told him where to stop. No one guided him. And yet, every day, his steps paused in front of Duke's kennel, as if programmed by the heart. Each time he stood there, silent, unmoving, just pure presence, Duke would raise his head. It made Ellie start paying attention. Unconsciously, she began to notice little details she had never picked up before. How Duke's ears twitched slightly at Elliot's steps. How he no longer tensed when someone stood close. How his gaze lingered on Elliot longer than it did with anyone else. Not confused, not wary, but with something that looked very much like trust. One morning, Elliot arrived earlier than usual and stood there longer. Ellie quietly sat in the back. She didn't interfere, didn't draw attention to herself. She simply watched Duke as one might read a treasured book turned to a new chapter. And then, she saw something that had never happened before. Duke slowly stood up and stepped toward the front of the kennel, closer to Elliot. He didn't wag his tail, didn't whimper with joy, but each step held something different. Not avoidance, but intent. no longer trembling all over, only breathing a little faster, as if crossing a hazy boundary between self-protection and a need to connect. Elliot didn't step back, nor did he step forward. He simply stood there, hand gently pressed to the wire mesh, face calm and almost motionless. And Duke, less than a hand's width away, stopped. Their eyes met. No words, no obvious signals, but something very real, very deep, was just bridged between two untouched solitudes. Ellie felt her heart tighten, not just from emotion, but from understanding. Duke was changing, and that change didn't come solely from her patience, but from a child who never spoke a word. From that day, Ellie began keeping notes on their interaction. She wrote down every reaction, every small sign Duke gave whenever Elliot appeared. More stable breathing, faster response time, visibly reduced tension in his body. Once, when Elliot suddenly raised his hand to point at something down the hallway, Duke didn't flinch. Instead, he tilted his head, as if following the boy's gesture. It was the first time Duke had reacted to a sudden movement without panic. And as she reread her notes, a thought suddenly struck Ellie. Could Duke become a therapy dog? The idea made her pause, not from doubt, but from the sheer boldness of such a possibility. A dog was once labeled beyond recovery. A creature who once avoided all contact, now stepping forward toward a human. And not just any human, but a special child. In emotional therapy, people often say that not every dog is suited to be a therapy dog, but if a soul can walk through its own pain to comfort the pain of others, that can't be taught. It's a gift. And Ellie, seeing the way Duke now looked at Elliot, not with fear, but with a quiet attentiveness, began to believe that somewhere deep inside, Duke carried a healing instinct even he didn't yet know he had. Elliot remained silent, as always. But every time he left the hallway, just before his mother took his hand to lead him away, he always glanced back. Just a brief look, enough to remind Duke, "I'll come back." And one afternoon, Duke stood there for a long time after the boy disappeared. Ellie needed no further confirmation. She knew that between those two wounded souls, something was taking root. Quietly, silently, but so powerfully that the world outside would have to stop and listen. Ellie didn't need any further confirmation. She knew that between those two wounded souls, a connection was taking root. Quiet, gentle, but powerful enough to make the outside world pause and listen. But just as that fragile hope finally placed one foot on solid ground, a chill from the past swept in. Not loud, not dramatic, but sharp enough to send a shiver down Ellie's spine. That morning, the rescue center was unusually quiet. Ellie arrived earlier than usual. She visited Duke's kennel first, as always, and caught him stretching out peacefully, his ears flicking slightly at the sound of familiar footsteps. Never before had Duke's expression carried so much calm, not exactly joy, but a kind of serene stillness she had never seen. It made Ellie smile, the kind of relief a mother feels watching her child sleep soundly after a long fever. She had just placed down his food when a voice called from the back hallway, low but urgent. "Ellie, can you come to my office for a moment?" It was Dr. Clara's voice. Ellie paused. She had never heard Clara speak to her in that tone. Not loud, but weighed down by something held back. When she entered the office, Clara was standing behind her desk, holding a worn-out file folder. Its spine frayed, some pages inside folded at the corners. On the desk was another file, identical in color and format, with a neighboring serial number. Clara didn't sit. She gestured for Ellie to come closer, then opened both folders side by side. "There's been a mix-up," Clara said, eyes locked on the printed veterinary pathology records. "And it's not a small one." Ellie frowned, but said nothing. Clara turned to the blood test results, the ones Ellie had briefly reviewed when Duke first arrived. Then she pointed to a short line at the bottom of the report. "Positive for Category C infectious disease. Recommend euthanasia if behavior does not improve after 14 days. Ellie's heart sank, but Clara quickly slid the second file next to it. "And this," she said, is Duke's actual test. This report showed something entirely different. Negative for all infectious disease groups. No signs of acute viral infection. There were 2 dogs that looked nearly identical from 2 different shelters, Clara explained. Duke and another named Bolt. Their records were mixed up when entered into the central database. From day 1, every behavioral assessment of Duke has been filtered through the lens of a condition he never had. Ellie stood frozen. She pictured those early days, the vacant eyes, the trembling as if the life had been drained from him, the panic at every loud sound. She had once believed Duke was a non-recoverable case, but she had never believed he deserved to die. And yet, because of one mistyped line, he'd been placed on the euthanasia list, not for his behavior, but for an illness that never existed in his blood. She said nothing for a few minutes. Clara stayed quiet, too, as if giving Ellie time to absorb what had just happened. Then Ellie looked up, her gaze steady. "I'm filing a formal objection," she said. "Today." Clara nodded. "I'm ready to sign every page, and if needed, I'll speak before the board. You're not alone." That night, Ellie sat in front of her computer, well past midnight. She typed each word of the objection letter as if she were writing a sworn testimony on behalf of a life that had never truly been protected. She attached the correct medical records, Clara's detailed notes, and scanned progress reports documenting Duke's behavioral improvements, with dates and signatures. She even included photographs, images of Duke looking at Elliot, the first time he gently touched Ellie's hand with his nose. Each photo bathed in soft light, not due to technique, but because Duke's eyes no longer held fear. She ended the letter with a handwritten line. "If this life is taken because of a clerical error, where does justice for animals truly stand?" The next morning, Clara officially submitted the objection to the shelter's management board. There was no immediate reply. But Ellie didn't wait in helplessness. She kept coming to Duke every day as if normalcy itself were the strongest act of resistance against the injustice threatening him. She didn't say anything to him. But Duke, by instinct, seemed to sense something was wrong. He stood closer to her, held her gaze longer. He no longer ate and stepped back. He stayed after finishing as if to say, "I'm still here, are you?" And Ellie, with an unwavering gaze, silently replied, "I'm not going anywhere. Not while justice still lies buried in silence." This time she wouldn't wait in silence. She would fight. Because sometimes, for a soul to keep living, it takes more than compassion. It takes unwavering belief. That afternoon, the center buzzed with its usual rhythm. But to Ellie, each step down the concrete hallway felt heavier, deeper. In her hands was a thick file, the evidence of a truth that, if no one stood for it, would see a life quietly erased, as if it had never existed. She stopped outside the office door of Director Michael Turner. Inside, he was reviewing reports under the yellow glow of a desk lamp, wearing his usual thoughtful frown. He looked up as she entered, eyes narrowing slightly as if anticipating something difficult. "Ellie?" he asked, folding the papers in front of him. She placed the file on his desk, but didn't sit. "I need to talk to you about Duke." Michael leaned back slowly. "I know you and Clara submitted a report. I read it. The medical record mix-up was a mistake. No argument there. I forwarded it to the admin team for correction." "This isn't just a clerical error," Ellie said, her voice low but clear. "It's a mistake that could have killed him. Duke was put on the euthanasia list because of a line typed wrong. He was never sick. And I believe you've seen his behavioral progress." Michael stayed quiet for a moment, then sighed. "I know he's shown some improvement. But Ellie, we're in a tight phase right now. The list of dogs waiting to be saved grows every day. We have to prioritize cases with quicker recoveries, ones more likely to get adopted. You know that." "But Duke is recovering," Ellie said, her voice unwavering. "Every day, step by step. You've seen it. He started interacting. Let me touch him. Responded to Elliot, a nonverbal child. He's not just a rescue case. He's becoming a healing dog." Michael raised an eyebrow. "You're suggesting training him as a therapy dog?" "I'm not making promises," Ellie replied gently. "But I'm pointing to a possibility. A spark. And if we extinguish it for the sake of numbers, what are we choosing? Convenience or compassion? The room fell quiet. From the hallway, a dog barked, distant, then fading. Ellie stood firm, her hands clenched as if holding something fragile inside. Michael folded his arms. You've put a lot of hope in this dog, I understand, but I've been here a lot longer than you. I've seen dogs we thought were better suddenly lash out. I've seen ones kept for emotional reasons, only for no one to ever adopt them. We can't gamble safety on feelings. No one's asking for a gamble, Ellie said, her voice dropping low. But if it's feelings and patience that brought a creature back from the edge, maybe what we need isn't absolute safety, but a chance. Silence thickened in the room. Ellie looked him in the eye. I'm asking for 1 week, 7 days. If Duke doesn't make any further progress, if he truly can't recover, I won't object anymore. But if in that time he proves he can, please, let him live. Michael didn't reply immediately. He lowered his head, rubbing his temple as if weighing the weight of it all. After a few seconds, he looked up again. His eyes still firm, but no longer closed off. 1 week, he said decisively. No more. Ellie nodded, exhaling a breath she'd held for days. Thank you, she said softly. Her voice quieted, but her eyes sparked with unmistakable hope. I won't waste it. As she walked out of his office, the sun was dipping westward, casting a warm glow along the hallway leading to the kennels. She returned to Duke, who lay as he always did. But today, when he looked up at her, something had changed. His gaze was deeper, calmer, as if he already knew that she had come back, that she was still here, that her promise hadn't been broken. She sat down, slow and silent. Her hand opened, not to offer food, but to let Duke know. I protected you. Now it's your turn to keep going. And Duke, in his quiet way, without wagging his tail or moving closer, just lay there, eyes locked on hers, long enough for her heart to know. He understood, and he wouldn't let her down. Not this time. Not in these final 7 days. And in that fleeting moment, Duke didn't run. He stood still in that embrace, ears tilted back, not from fear, but as if he was, for the first time, learning what it felt like to be protected. That morning unfolded under a gentle light, not glaring gold, not gloomy gray, a thin veil of sunlight, as though the sky itself was quietly waiting for something to happen. Ellie walked the main hallway in silence, the soft rhythm of her rubber soles brushing the cold tiles the only sound. Today was day 3 of the 7-day reprieve she had fought for. Only 4 days remained, and with each step toward Duke's kennel, her heart slowed, as if willing every second to last longer. Duke lay half awake, half resting, head on his front paws, eyes just open enough to register movement. But when Ellie approached, he raised his head completely. No startle, no shrinking back, just a calm, almost still gaze. Ellie sat down, as always. Her hand brushed the kennel lock. The key, as always, rested in the pocket of her coat, a habit more than a necessity since she'd never used it. Not because she didn't want to, but because she knew. Duke's journey couldn't be rushed, not even by kindness. But today, something in the air felt different. The silence wasn't tense anymore. It felt like it was waiting. And so she unlocked the door. The click echoed. Soft, but unmistakable. Duke didn't flinch. He just kept his eyes on her. Ellie didn't speak or wave him over. She simply slid the kennel door aside, leaving a gap, not wide, but enough. Enough for a creature who'd lived curled up in fear to cross through if he chose. Then she took a step back and sat beside the open door, her palm resting on her knee, turned upward, beckoning gently. And then she held still. The rest was up to Duke. He remained motionless for a long time. A very long time. A breeze slipped in through the far hallway window, ruffling the fine hairs on his neck. Out there was an entire world, far bigger than the not quite 3 square meters he'd called his own for years, and infinitely more terrifying. Ellie didn't dare breathe too loudly. Her eyes stayed on Duke's, steady, open, without pressure or expectation. Just presence. Pure and honest. And then, Duke moved one paw off the familiar mat. He didn't bolt, didn't dash forward. He simply placed one paw outside, touching the bare floor like someone just waking from a dream and testing whether the world was real. One paw, then another. Then, slowly, all of him stepped through the doorway for the first time. Ellie felt her throat tighten. Duke stood in front of her. Not too close, not too far. Just enough to make one thing clear. This wasn't obedience. It was a choice. She opened her arms. No commands, no treats, no strings attached. And Duke, after one long blink, took another step forward, lowered his head, and pressed his nose into Ellie's chest. For the first time, he chose to walk into someone's arms. She wrapped him in a hug, so light it seemed any pressure might shatter this fragile moment. But Duke didn't pull away. He didn't tense. He even exhaled. One deep, long breath, like something he'd held in for years. Ellie's heart squeezed. Every hour of silent sitting, every time she fought back tears at the sight of his haunted gaze, all of it came pouring out in this single, quiet nuzzle. She didn't need chicken today. No rewards, no goals, just one thing. Duke had chosen trust. Not trust in food, not routine, but in a hand that had waited through every tremble, every retreat, every sidelong glance. This is how a rejected life is reborn, not through miracles, but through trust lit slowly, piece by piece. At that moment, Elliot entered at the end of the hallway, silent as always. The boy stood still, holding a small notebook, eyes on Ellie and Duke. No words, no sound, but his gaze softened, as if he too had just witnessed something so precious he didn't dare disturb it. And Duke, still in Ellie's arms, looked up toward the boy. No bark, no panic, just a gentle tilt of the head, like a silent greeting. That day, Duke's kennel door remained open. He didn't go far, but he had stepped beyond the line between surviving and truly living. News of Duke stepping out spread quietly but powerfully throughout the center. Those who had seen him curled up in corners, those who had once labeled him beyond saving, now stood silently in the hallway, watching him with eyes tinged by something new, a mix of awe and unease, as though they were meeting their shattered assumptions face to face. And then, from that moment, another door opened. Not a kennel gate, but the door to a still unfinished journey, rescuing the lives still left behind in the breeding facility where Duke had once been imprisoned. Michael, after reviewing original records from local authorities, discovered that the facility where Duke was rescued still had areas that hadn't been thoroughly searched. At the time of Duke's extraction, his condition had been so critical that the team was forced to withdraw early. But now, seeing the clarity in Duke's eyes, Michael understood. They had missed something. A small team was formed. Ellie, Clara, Michael, and 2 volunteers stepped forward. And Duke, no longer trembling, no longer the fragile one, was brought along as a special member of the mission. No one said it outright, but they all silently hoped that Duke's instinct and memory might guide them to the dark corners humans couldn't see, or hadn't dared to face. The small truck rumbled off under a misty morning sky. The road to the old site twisted and turned, weaving through patches of scrubland, broken roots, and scattered debris, just like the broken past that still lingered there. When the truck finally stopped, the sight before them silenced everyone. A row of rusted kennels, moss-covered and deep within the sparse forest, eerily still. Duke's leash was unhooked, though a light lid remained for safety. He stepped out of the vehicle, not panicked, just still, then took a deep breath. Ellie noticed his chest rising and falling faster, ears flicking constantly as if soaking in every sound, every memory lurking in the moldy air. Duke started walking. No commands, no coaxing, just quiet, steady steps, one, then another, as if retracing trauma with the very feet that once trembled in its grip. They passed empty, decaying kennels, cages streaked with time. This place had once been Duke's non-life. A place where cries for help were choked behind bars, where every contact came as a blow, a clank, or a name called with no reply. He led them to the main kennel block, the one that had been unlocked during the first rescue. Most dogs had been taken out already. But Duke didn't stop. He squeezed through a narrow gap at the back, entering a small yard overgrown with weeds. The others followed, ducking low to avoid rusted wires and tangled branches. Clara switched on her flashlight. Michael signaled for silence. Duke stopped before a worn metal hatch, camouflaged in moss, nearly invisible against the ground. He didn't bark. He simply lowered his head, sniffed the earth, and gave a soft whimper. It was barely audible, but chilling. And before anyone could react, Duke raised a paw and gently scratched at the metal. Not frantic, just persistent. One scratch, a pause, another, as if trying to wake something buried underneath. Michael stepped up and pried the hatch open with a crowbar. The rusted panel creaked, revealing a dark cellar below. A wave of damp, moldy air wafted out. Then, from deep inside, a faint cry echoed. Thin, weak, haunting. The team froze. Ellie shone her light down. In the dim glow, two sets of eyes stared back, terrified, starving, nearly gone. A mother dog and her pup, curled in the corner of a hidden cage, too weak to make a sound. Duke stood above them, eyes locked. Ellie's fists clenched. She looked at Duke, and in his eyes, there was no longer the blankness she'd once known. There was something deeper, older, clearer. He knew the pain in that cage, because he had lived it. And in that moment, Ellie understood why he had wanted to return, not to face his past, but to save the lives still forgotten, like he once was. This time, Duke wouldn't let that happen again. Not now that he had learned how to live, not when he knew that beyond those bars, a door could stay open, and that someone was still waiting, arms wide, ready to welcome life back in. Never in all her years of rescue work had Ellie seen a dog lead by gaze, not through the instinct to hunt, but as if passing down an old memory to save a life in the present. And Duke, standing at the edge of that dark pit, didn't bark, didn't howl. He only whimpered softly, scratched gently, but everything he did had a purpose, as if he knew every crevice of that despair and was determined to pull someone else from it before it was too late. Michael was the first to climb down. He swept his flashlight across the rotted wood walls and cracked cement floor. The air below was thick with the stench of old feces and dried blood, forcing him to hold his breath. And then he saw it. At the farthest corner, beneath a nearly collapsed mesh panel, was a tiny creature curled up, trembling, fur-soaked, barely breathing. A puppy, smaller than a human palm. It no longer had the strength to cry, but its eyes were wide, startled, holding the look of a being who knew it stood between life and death, with nothing left to cling to. Michael paused, not from hesitation, but because he couldn't believe what he was seeing. If not for Duke, this creature would have stayed buried in that darkness, an invisible scar in a closed investigation. Ellie sat at the edge of the pit, holding Duke's leash, eyes locked on the scene below, her chest tight with emotion she couldn't name. Clara and a volunteer carefully pulled away the rotted planks, creating room for Michael to carry the puppy out. Duke stood beside them, ears gently laid back, eyes never leaving the small creature being lifted from the shadows. And then, just as it seemed over, Duke barked. A single, deep bark, clear and deliberate, not alarm, not fear. It was a signal. Michael, still cradling the first pup, froze. His flashlight followed Duke's gaze, toward a narrow space between two collapsed steel cages, too dark for light to reach. He crouched down. A faint sound emerged. A whimper, like the last breath of a life on the verge of fading. Duke barked again, this time more sharply, pointing directly at the void. This time, everyone heard it. Someone else was in there. Without a word, Michael turned over a fallen metal panel. Beneath rubble and mud, another puppy emerged, even smaller than the first. Limp, lifeless. But when the flashlight hit its face, its eyelids twitched. It was alive. Clara rushed over, wrapping the soaked body in her jacket, gently tapping, checking reflexes. Ellie dropped to her knees, unable to speak, her eyes already blurred with tears. Duke just stood there. He didn't bark again. He only watched as the tiny creature was carried out. No dramatic reaction. But in his eyes was something unmistakable. Quiet certainty. He had been right. He had known someone was there, and he would not let another soul be buried in silence as he once was. Michael slumped next to the pit's edge, his shirt damp with sweat. He exhaled deeply and looked at Duke. Longer than usual. Not with the eyes of a man who once signed a death order, but with the eyes of someone who had just witnessed the impossible. A dog once paralyzed by noise, now guiding others to safety. He saved them, Michael said softly. If Duke hadn't been here today. Ellie nodded, her eyes still on Duke. They never would have been found. That afternoon, as the team left the breeding site, the truck carried 2 small lives wrapped in warm towels, wheezing but breathing. And in the center of the vehicle, Duke sat still. Head lowered, not proud, not triumphant. Just quiet. As wind slipped through the cracked windows and golden afternoon light bathed his mottled coat, it was as though the world itself was crowning him, not with noise or applause, but with reverence. Duke needed no medals, but in every heart in that truck, he had become something irreplaceable, a symbol of what shattered souls could still become. And then, the unexpected happened. A video, barely a minute long, captured the morning Duke first stepped out of his kennel. It showed nothing flashy, no edits, no music, just a silent moment. Ellie's arms open wide, Duke hesitating, then quietly stepping forward and placing his head into her open hand. The person who filmed it was Liam, a young volunteer who had joined the center 3 weeks earlier. That day, he'd simply walked past, paused at the scene, and, like most young people, pulled out his phone to record what felt like something special. But when he watched it again at home, he realized it wasn't the scene that was remarkable. It was the feeling. Something in that moment reached deep into the viewer's heart. He uploaded the clip with a simple caption: "The dog who once trembled at the sight of a human hand. Today he chose to walk toward one, not for a treat, but for trust." No one expected how fast it would spread. Within a single night, the video had tens of thousands of shares, then hundreds of thousands. Animal lover communities, rescue organizations, and even major media pages reposted it, calling Duke names like the Silent Warrior, the Face of Reborn Trust, and the Second Chance Dog. The image of Duke bowing his head into Ellie's hand, caught just as morning light filtered through the kennel, became iconic. People printed it on posters and t-shirts, some even tattooed it on their wrists, as a reminder of patience's quiet power. In the comments, thousands shared their own stories about abandoned dogs, children afraid to trust, and adults who had given up on themselves. They wrote that this video made them cry, made them hope again, and made them feel, perhaps for the first time in a long while, that they too were worthy of a hand waiting for them to step toward. The rescue center was flooded with letters, calls, and emails. People asked about Duke's recovery, offered donations, and offered to sponsor the medical care of dogs like him. One message read, "I once shut my heart to the world, but seeing Duke step out of that kennel, I thought, if a dog so broken can learn to trust again, maybe I can too." Ellie read each line with tears in her eyes and disbelief in her heart. She never imagined that her quiet act, sitting beside a dog no one else dared to touch, would reach thousands of hearts across the world. But what moved her most was the Duke himself. In the days that followed, he stayed the same, unbothered by cameras, untouched by fame. He still stepped out every morning, still curled up beside Ellie as she wrote her reports, still tilted his head when Elliot appeared at the door. He didn't need to know he was a symbol, because for Duke, the only thing that mattered was this. When he stepped toward a hand, he no longer had to close his eyes. And Ellie knew. There was no spotlight more honest than the moment a creature once terrified learns to trust again. No award was more meaningful than the first look Duke ever gave her, the one that made the world stop and listen. So when the first journalist called to request an interview, Ellie said just one sentence. "I didn't do anything extraordinary. I just sat there, waiting for a soul to decide this world still had someone who wouldn't come to hurt." From that day on, the world began to see Duke with different eyes, not with fear, nor with pity for his past, but with gentle respect reserved for those who've overcome their most primal fears to offer trust, and in doing so, lead others out from the shadows. News that Duke had helped rescue 2 puppies from the underground pit spread quickly, but no one expected the next miracle to come from a boy who had lived in silence, and that Duke would be the key to unlocking his voice. Elliot had been coming to the center weekly for animal-assisted therapy. He had severe language delay and had never spoken a full, clear word despite various interventions. Ellie remembered the first time she saw Elliot standing outside Duke's kennel, notebook in hand, eyes speaking volumes that even adults struggled to interpret. From that moment on, Elliot always chose to sit near Duke. No prompting, no rewards. There was a stillness in Duke that Elliot could touch. After Duke was officially removed from the unrecoverable list and began his therapy dog trial phase, Ellie requested that he be included in Elliot's special Tuesday morning class, a small group of just 4 children and a speech specialist. On the first day, Duke simply lay by Ellie's feet, watching as Elliot colored in the corner. He didn't move. He didn't intrude. In the second week, Elliot stood up and placed a small wooden block beside Duke, then stepped back in silence. Duke didn't move, only tilted his head and let out a soft breath, an action that made Elliot laugh, though no one else heard the sound. In week 3, Elliot placed his hand on Duke's back. In week 4, he drew a picture of Duke using a purple crayon, a color his mother said he had never touched before. And then came week 5, the week of the miracle. That morning was like any other. Ellie brought Duke as usual. Elliot sat in his usual spot. Class began with a picture naming game, an exercise Elliot always avoided. But today, when it was his turn, instead of retreating into silence, Elliot turned to look at Duke, who was lying nearby, head resting on his front paws, eyes half closed. The room fell still, and then, so quietly the teacher questioned if she'd heard it at all, Elliot said his first word, a whisper, soft as breath, yet as clear as light breaking into a room too long in the dark. Duke, just one word. But inside it, a whole world was beginning to bloom. Elliot's mother burst into tears. The teacher covered her mouth. Ellie froze, eyes fixed on Duke, who had now opened his eyes and was looking at Elliot with his familiar, gentle gaze. He didn't move forward. He didn't bark. He simply looked, as if he understood that there was nothing more he needed to do. Elliot had crossed that threshold on his own, carried by the trust that had grown quietly in the presence of a dog who once knew nothing of gentleness. After that session, the center officially certified Duke as a qualified therapy dog, not just because of his stable behavior or his responsiveness to commands, but because he had done something no training could ever teach. He had become the bridge between silence and speech, fear and hope. Ellie stood outside the classroom, her hand trembling as she wrote the last line in her report. But in her heart was a strange, quiet feeling. Not blinding joy, but a deep, settled peace. She knew Duke's life would never again be just about stepping from the shadows into the light, but about becoming that light, passed on quietly, steadily, without fanfare. And Elliot, the boy who had never spoken, had chosen Duke as the first name he would ever say. Not because anyone told him to, but because his heart already knew. This was the one who had seen him, and never once asked him to be anything more than what he already was. The news of that turning point traveled far, reaching places Ellie never thought it would. But alongside the miracles, another door opened, more serious and urgent. An official investigation into illegal breeding facilities was launched, fueled by a wave of petitions from the public and animal welfare groups. Among the first names called to testify was Ellie Collins. That morning, the sky held no sunlight. Heavy clouds pressed low, forming a ceiling of gray that seemed to match the gravity of the day. The town hall was hosting a public hearing, and for the first time in her life, Ellie walked into it not alone. Duke walked beside her. No harness, no tight collar, just a soft lead around his neck like a ribbon. Yet it was that calm, steady posture, the quiet strength in his stride, that made those waiting in the corridor stop and step aside, watching with silent reverence. Ellie didn't wear anything extravagant. A white shirt and simple slacks. Neat, just like the way she always appeared beside Duke. But her eyes, as she passed through the doors of the hearing room, carried the weight of stories never fully told. Duke sat at her feet, head lowered slightly, eyes watching the podium ahead. When the coordinator invited Ellie to speak, she stood, walking to the center of the room, the lights catching beads of sweat on her brow. But her voice didn't shake. She spoke, not dramatically, not theatrically, but plainly, truthfully. She spoke of the first day she saw Duke curled in the corner of his kennel, trembling so violently he couldn't even open his eyes. She spoke of the hours spent sitting in silence, simply so he would know someone was there not to hurt him. She spoke of the soft whimper Duke gave at the edge of the underground pit, of the 2 lives he helped rescue by sheer instinct, of the name Elliot, spoken aloud for the first time, because of the gaze of a dog who once didn't know what kindness looked like. And then she stopped, not because she had nothing left to say, but because that moment, Duke, still seated calmly beside her, raised his head and gently lowered his nose onto Ellie's hand, which rested quietly on her lap. A small gesture, but in that stern, watchful space, it made the room fall completely silent. A photojournalist near the door instinctively snapped a picture. That image, just hours later, was shared everywhere. Duke, looking up with soft eyes, touching the hand of the woman who had saved him, right in the middle of a public hearing. No sound, no words, but it spoke everything that needed to be said. A council member dabbed her eyes with a tissue. The chairperson gave a slow, thoughtful nod. Ellie knew. Not everyone was quick to empathize with stories about animals, but even the hardest hearts couldn't ignore a moment of silent, unquestioning tenderness. As she walked out of the building, Ellie didn't look at the press cameras. She only looked down, gently brushing her hand over Duke's back. "You just testified," she whispered, without saying a single word. Duke walked beside her, calm as ever. But there was something different in his gait that day. Not just footsteps, but a peace that had matured through every storm. And in the photo that went viral that afternoon, people didn't just see a woman placing her hand on a dog's head. They saw an entire journey, where love needed no language, where truth wasn't proven by rules, but by one quiet, unwavering touch. A week after the public hearing, while the emotional aftershocks were still echoing through the community and animal welfare organizations were rallying calls for action, Ellie realized her mission could no longer stop at saving a single life, because Duke, through every quiet step, had shown her something larger, a path where broken souls could do more than heal. They could become light for others still in the dark. The idea was born in the middle of the night. By morning, Ellie was at Clara's door. The woman who had once quietly corrected a record to give Duke a chance to live, who had stayed in the background like a steady second heartbeat through the entire journey. They sat at the old wooden table in the rescue center's office, sunlight slanting through the window, falling across the folder Ellie placed on the table. It wasn't legal paperwork. It was a blueprint, a detailed plan for founding a brand new center. The name wasn't grand, wasn't flashy, but it made Clara go silent when she read the first line. Whisper of Trust. Not a place to train dogs to follow commands, Ellie said, but a place where forgotten dogs learn to hear their hearts again. And when they're ready, they'll become companions for people who've lost trust too. Veterans with PTSD, children with autism, survivors of trauma no one can see. Clara didn't speak for a few seconds, but the look she gave Ellie was a deep yes. No signatures needed, no contract. Because she understood that some projects don't begin with paperwork. They begin with something too real to deny. 3 months later, the center opened in a quiet countryside spot. Wide fields stretching toward the horizon, tall trees casting shade over the training yard, and a modest wooden house, thoughtfully built. There were no barred cages, just low wooden fences. The windows were set low so the dogs could see outside. In each training room, a large shared mat for people and dogs to sit together. Not owner and pet, just companions. Duke was the first dog to step into the grass yard. No trainer had to lead him. He walked down the wooden hallway on his own, sniffing each bush, then laid down on the main steps, marking his place not with dominance, but with peace. A few days later, the first dogs arrived, most carrying signs of the past, patchy fur, faint scars, eyes that avoided contact. Ellie didn't command them to do anything. She simply approached, sat, and waited, just as she had with Duke. Elliot was invited on the first day. He could now speak in short sentences. When he saw Duke lying under the tree near the training yard, he ran over on his own, no one leading him, and sat beside Duke, saying gently, "Duke, today let's make new friends together, okay?" And Duke, as always, didn't answer. But he lifted his head, nudged the boy's shoulder, then stood and followed him into the center's first class. From that moment on, Whisper of Trust was no longer just a center. It became a home, where creatures once labeled burdens learned to become irreplaceable. Every dog here wasn't chosen for its looks, but for the empathy born of its past. Every human who came wasn't defined by diagnosis, but by the potential unlocked when someone was patient enough to listen. And Duke, no longer a symbol, no longer a viral hero, was now fully himself, quietly walking the yard at dusk, resting his head on a child's hand as they learned to write, or lying beside a veteran staring at the open field in silence. He wore no badge, needed no title. Only his gaze remained the same, the one he gave Ellie long ago from that dark kennel. Now softer, but just as true. Someone once waited for me. Now it's my turn to wait for someone else. Duke, now no longer an icon, no longer the internet's hero, was simply a presence. Walking the grass each evening, resting his head on a child learning to write, sitting quietly beside a veteran staring out toward the distant trees. That afternoon, as the sun slipped toward the far end of the field and beams of light stretched across the wooden fences, Ellie walked slowly down the stone path leading to the backyard of the center. A light breeze rustled the tall grass, whispering like an old friend whose words she no longer needed to translate, because her heart already knew. In the middle of the field, Duke was lying still, one leg draped lazily over his side, eyes half closed, soaking in the soft silence of the evening. Beside him was Elliot, the boy who once never spoke, now sitting comfortably, legs crossed, head bowed, one hand resting gently on Duke's neck, as if that spot was the safest place on earth. No one spoke. Ellie stopped a few steps away, careful not to disturb the rare stillness. From where she stood, she saw only a tousled-haired boy beneath the light, and a dog once born into darkness, now resting peacefully beneath an open sky. Elliot leaned in and whispered something only Duke heard. Then his hand pressed slightly tighter, stroking down the dog's back. A small, familiar motion, meaningless to the world. But to Ellie, it was proof. Proof that every silent hour, every tear, every patient wait had been worth it. And then Duke looked up. His gaze found Ellie. There was no fear, no defense, no hesitation, No curled body hiding from the world. Just a clear, deep, steady look. The eyes of a creature who once distrusted everything, now gazing out into the world as though he had finally learned to believe. Ellie didn't raise a hand. She only smiled, a smile that asked for nothing, only mirrored what she saw. A soul finally home. The sun dipped lower. The breeze grew cooler. Elliot leaned his head onto Duke's shoulder, and Duke stayed still. No wagging, no barking, but every muscle is soft, as if melting into a dream with no monsters. Maybe in that moment, where light met quiet, you could believe some wounds never fully heal, but if someone stays, waits, listens, they stop hurting. And Duke, the dog who once didn't know what a gentle touch felt like, now lay in the heart of the world. No fences, no boundaries, no hands holding him back. Because in the end, he chose to stay. Stay within the trust. Stay within someone's heart. Stay as a quiet reminder that there are eyes which once shut out the entire world. But sometimes, all it takes is for someone to believe first, and those eyes will open again. Gently, fully, and forever. Maybe the greatest miracle isn't how much Duke changed, but how he made the world look at itself, through his eyes, and ask, what if trust was all it took to begin again? From a dog who once couldn't look up, he became the safe place for silent children, for scarred hearts, and for us, those still learning to trust in kindness. Have you ever witnessed a moment of rebirth like Duke's? Share your story in the comments, because maybe your story is the reason someone else keeps going. If this story touched your heart, leave a like, share it with someone you love, and subscribe to the channel for more moving journeys about love, trust, and healing between humans and their four-legged friends. Thank you for listening and for believing.